Well, joining me now via Skype to discuss this development and much more, I have with me Tengi George Ikoli, Program Coordinator, Nigerian Natural Resource Charter, that's the NNRC. Good to have you on the Breakfast Show today.
Thank you for having me. Good morning.
Now, Tengi, let's start off with the OPEC decision in terms of production cuts so far. Well, this is a little bit of a setback in terms of our revenue generation and also our production capacity at this point in time, but the aim is quite necessary, a step towards redeeming the value of hydrocarbon resources as well at the global market. But juxtaposing this and then the passage of the PIB and exploring the oil and gas sector, we've not necessarily put our best foot forward. What's your take on this move so far in terms of the passage and then OPEC production cuts?
Okay, I'll start by laying a bit of a foundation in terms of the OPEC cuts. We're all aware, obviously, that last year there was a global pandemic which affected economic activity globally, and there were a lot of reactions to this. As a result, OPEC had also had a meeting to determine what potential production cuts that there could be. Nigeria had been assigned from the period of beginning of May to June last year of 1.41 million barrels per day. And then after that, we had July to December, 1.495 million barrels per day. And then subsequently for the 6 months thereafter, which would take us to April 2022, we had a 1.57 assignment. And now there's a budget production cut by 313 thousand barrels per day. Why that's important for Nigeria is in terms of our budget. Our budget is about 13.58 trillion naira. And of that, expected oil revenues are meant to account for about 2 trillion naira. And within that, we have pegged our budget at $40 a barrel, which I think is quite conservative and a bit more realistic. And then we have an estimate of 1.86 million barrels per day. With that cut of 313, we will not be able to make that figure. And again, that's projected for January, February, and March. So that's quite an effect that would have on the on our revenues. Obviously, as you said in your introduction as well, the GMD Milicaria NNPC has projected that condensate will be used to adjust for that figure. But then again, there are different options that can be available. You've mentioned the PIB. So one really key thing that's being done with the Petroleum Industry Bill is to create incentives, make Nigeria more competitive than its counterparts in other countries to attract the investments that we need in our oil sector to ramp up production. But again, we can look at other sectors because oil, as we know, as we discussed, OPEC has an impact on the production levels for that. We can look to gas potentially, as you've mentioned. Opening up the midstream would be something that would be very effective for making up our revenues. And the PIB has a lot to do with that. So its passage should be encouraged and should be, sorry?
The passage should be timely.
Yes.
That's one of the biggest focus we also have.
Yes, the passage should be timely. Drivers. Yes, because they still have that conversation going, but we need those funds, especially now that the 2021 budget has started running. So we need to pass that PIB as soon as possible so we can start to augment those revenues that we will potentially lose. We've mentioned condensate, but also what are the incentives for condensate? We've made there's a 300 to 400 K that we tend to make on that. How do we ramp that up? Because now with the OPEC cuts we've seen last year, it's been a bit debatable in terms of OPEC saying that Nigeria sort of augments its production by condensate. How can Nigeria tend to leverage that? How can we incentivize those that do help us with the condensate production as well?
And now we have a new focus in terms of renewable energy, but before we go into all of that, it's quite a huge investment plan that would also require. But now with a fresh focus on gas, what's level of infrastructure do you expect now? What sort of conversations do you also expect we have in country in terms of developing this sector so that then we can actually enjoy the proceeds? This is a cleaner source of energy. We look at issues around gas flaring. We look at commercialization. We look at the purchase of gas as well to power our electricity, our thermal plants, and a whole lot more. What sort of conversation and how robust do you expect this to be followed through in terms of aggressive engagement this time around? Because we've seen quite a lull. It's not necessarily timely interventions or policies that we've seen over the past few years. So how should we move in terms of chasing the gas policy in Nigeria this year?
Yeah, you're right. And I think what I would expect is the urgency, the understanding with the government reflection that we have limited amount of time to be able to ramp up in terms of gas. You've mentioned the energy mix globally, the shift away from fossil fuels. We now need to position Nigeria in a context where when the oil stops being a going concern, we have gas, we have a larger mix, and we're looking at it more broadly. The PIB is good in addressing the concerns that we've had in the past, but I share the concern that we're not being as progressive in terms of transitioning. So we should be looking at the larger energy mix, the gas to power, looking at the other bouquet, the renewables as well, and making a intertwined sort of energy solution and plans, instead of focusing a bit more piecemeal, the way we appear to be doing in terms of our oil and gas, and then other components. I think we should have a basket to look a bit more intently at it. And then you mentioned in terms of the commercialization, that was ramping up at some point, but has appeared to slow down, which I would expect that to ramp up as well. We've had gas flaring commitments as well, which have been from 2020 and 2030 to eradicate, but again, that has slowed down. So we need to ramp up all of this. Fair enough, we should not forget that we had COVID-19 and that impacted a lot of our plans. But then we can now still start ramping up this because Nigeria really relies on and needs an acceleration in terms of our gas commercialization and creating a gas infrastructure.
In wrapping up our conversation at this point in time, I'd just like you to sum your thoughts in about a minute. Now, what's your forecast for the year 2021 in terms of the oil and gas sector, still having in mind that we are dealing with the second wave of the COVID-19? Take, for example, across border, the West Texas Intermediate, OPEC, and then Brent crude is selling at about $53, $55 thereabout. It's gradually recovering, but we might be surprised to have any twist or turn. This is the COVID-19 we are dealing with. This is the second wave. Restrictions are still in place. Demand and supply issues still raise some red flags. What's your forecast for the year with having the COVID-19 in mind as well for the year 2021?
Okay, thank you. That's a very key question. I think in terms of our plans, we should learn from the lessons of 2020. Obviously, we're aware that we're in a situation where we had to cut our budgets when we had the COVID-19 pandemic at its height. I think we should consider that as well, given this second wave. I would have expected to see that sort of thinking in terms of the budget. What lessons have we learned? Even the OPEC meeting that was had on January 5th, they had to have it virtually as well. So what lessons, how do we start to cut the cost of governance in anticipation of this? We have a heavy recurrent expenditure still. How do we cut that down? The government is expecting to have savings in terms of its efficiency measures. With its government-owned enterprises, it expects to have efficiency gains from managing that. How do we also transfer that in terms of how we manage our different infrastructure? So we have NNPC as well coming up, a point that I want to make. Potentially when the prices increase as well, how would that affect in terms of the prices at the pump? How would not having fully deregulated a downstream sector, what sort of impact would that have? I think it's also something that we should consider in ramping up the petroleum industry bill, the passage of that.
Well, we'd like to see a speedy passage of the PIB. Thank you very much for your time on the Breakfast Show today. Thank you, George Ikole, the Program Coordinator of the Nigerian Natural Resource Charter, NNRC. Good morning.